Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm going to be testing Silent Hill F in 6 60-tier GPUs from Nvidia. And first up, we got the GeForce GTX 1060 6GB model right here. This is the MSI Gaming X version of the card. It's released in 2016 and it's from the Pascal architecture. And here we have it, guys. The GTX 1060 is now installed with the latest Nvidia drivers, which it still supports after 9 years, which is crazy, actually. And let's go over the settings first. We're starting at 1080p resolution with this card. Disregard the refresh rate there. It's always wrong in this game for some reason. And we're utilizing the lowest settings, aside from screen resolution and anti-aliasing, which is set to TAA. So we're at native 1080p resolution, utilizing lowest settings, and this GPU is actually handling it like a champ, in my opinion. This is a UE5 title. It's really demanding, although pretty well optimized for a UE5 title. But on a GTX 10 series card, UE5 is extremely intensive, all right? Yet the GTX 1066 GB model is doing a phenomenal job, in my opinion. Getting 40-ish frames per second. It is well below minimum requirements, but it hangs in there, as you can see. This is pretty crazy, guys. 40-ish frames, smooth frame time graph as well, although this game suffers from some stuttering issues, of course, later on in the game. But in this initial area, it's always very smooth, and this is also one of the more GPU-intensive areas in the game. So if it's getting 40-ish right here, down there in the city, which we'll get to in just a little bit, it should get around 50 frames per second, which is quite nice, especially given that the game asks for... Oh boy, that was a massive stutter there. Okay, or like a slowdown, not really a stutter. I would still not recommend this, since they ask for an 8GB GPU, and we have a 6GB GPU right here, so it's probably gonna suck in just a little bit. Okay, now we're in a cutscene. These are locked to 30 frames per second, and there we go. Now we're getting 40, 50 frames per second around here. Some spikes here and there, of course, which will only get worse as you progress into the story, but again, I expected a lot worse coming from a GTX 1060. Ooh, the textures were still loading there. Did you see that? They looked horrible, but now they actually loaded in and so on, and it's fine. And over here, I saw a massive, insane, like 2-second stutter with the RTX 5090, and I'm not seeing it here with the 1060. And this is the exact same PC where I tested the 5090. This is weird and interesting. Some people have been saying that they're also seeing issues with 50 series GPUs, and this game has issues with 50 series GPUs, so that could be what happened with my 5090 video. Let's enable FSR on quality now. And here we have it. So with FSR on quality, we're now close to 60 frames per second on a GTX 1066 GB. There are games out there with the same engine that ask for a GTX 1060 as the minimum requirements, or something similar, you know, and they aim for 30 FPS with these settings. Lowest settings, FSR quality, which renders the game at 720p, and it's upscaling it to 1080p, you know. Doesn't look terrible either. I'm using a 24-inch 1080p monitor here today. I can notice a ton more noise and ghosting, of course, with FSR enabled. Like, look at her head, for example. There's a little bit of ghosting there for sure, and a ton of pixelation, but it doesn't really look absolutely awful in my opinion. Oh, we're still seeing these spikes, dude. That's pretty interesting. Always in the same spot as well. Huh. Yeah, look at that. Those slowdowns. Alright, that must be something due to just the 1060 being old and it having 6GB of VRAM, even though it's not maxing them out. 50-something FPS now on average, so we gained about 12, 13 frames per second, or 11 maybe. I don't remember what kind of FPS we were getting before, but yeah, it's a noticeable improvement in terms of smoothness here whenever the game isn't stuttering, and yeah, it's actually playable. If you can put up with those slowdowns, which I know a lot of people who can, it's going to be playable on a GTX 1060, and it's going to look surprisingly decent. Obviously, if you compare these graphics to high settings in the game, or even medium settings in this game, these look terrible in comparison, but in a vacuum, it's not too terrible. But yeah, guys, I think that's it for the GTX 1060 with adequate settings for it. And now I'm gonna run Digital Foundry's optimized settings to be able to compare it a little bit with some other GPUs that we'll test here today. And here we have the Digital Foundry's optimized settings, guys. It has Lumen on high, which looks really pretty in this game. It changes the experience, in my opinion, but it's also extremely intensive, especially for the GTX 1060. I will be changing the texture quality over here, depending on how much VRAM the GPUs have. Right now, 6 gigabytes. I prefer to have it on low, and this is it. These are the rest of the settings. I'm keeping TAA, anti-aliasing as well. And, well, with the GTX 1060, given that Lumen is enabled, obviously, you saw this coming, right? It's just a terrible experience. It gets 20-ish frames per second. It still doesn't have a lot of stutters here in this initial part of the game, at least. This slowdown still happens, dropping us down into the 16 FPS. But it's just so we can compare it a little bit with other GPUs, because I will be testing a lot of them here today with these optimized settings, and they will run pretty well, I think. It's just that the 1060 is getting really old at this point, and with these technologies enabled from UE5, it just can't handle it. That's a little bit unfortunate, but expected, and at least we can play the game with 1060 on low settings, which is absolutely better than what I was expecting by looking at the requirements once again. So, not too terrible, but you definitely need to stick to low settings with this one. Next up, we have the GTX 1660. This is the Asus TUF version of the card. It's released in 2019, and it's from the Turing architecture. And here we have it. The GTX 1660 is now installed. You can see all of its specs here. As usual, it's also a 6 gigabyte GPU. And let's go over the settings. I have set it to 1080p again, utilizing the lowest settings and TAA. So we're back to native 1080p, lowest settings, like we started with the GTX 1060. And here we're getting 50-ish frames per second instead of those 40s and high 30s sometimes. We still see exactly the same behavior with this GPU in terms of the frame time graph going down this route over here. As you can see, those slowdowns there, and this happens every single time. Again, even if you go back there, I'm gonna try that actually. So we're right where we started. Let's keep on running in this direction and see if those spikes still happen. Okay, yeah, exactly. So it doesn't really matter whether or not you have loaded these areas already. There is always going to be a slowdown there with these 6 gigabyte GPUs. And I'm not even sure if it will happen with 8 gigabyte GPUs or 12 gigabyte 3060 as well. We shall find out in this video a little bit later, of course. And it's close to 60 FPS sometimes. I think it's going to reach 60 down there in the city area, which is quite nice, once again, because this is still a little bit slower than the GTX 1070 Ti that the game asks for the minimum requirements. And over here we're getting 40s, not too bad. Yeah, tiny little spikes here and there in the frame time graph, which is not going to be game-breaking at all. It's just those bigger slowdowns, yeah, those can put off a lot of people. But hey, I think the developers did what they could, given it's this engine that's being utilized. Once again, we see those textures just popping in right there, guys, like we saw with the GTX 1060. I think that's going to happen with all of the 6 gigabyte GPUs. I'm really curious to see the 2060, because that's also a 6 gigabyte card, but in terms of performance, it's going to be higher in performance than the minimum requirements. And finally, around this area, indeed, we get 60 FPS, 100% CPU utilization with a 9800X 3D there. That's pretty crazy. And a 1660, you know? Okay, it doesn't really matter. It was only for a split second. Yeah, it's fine. It's going to look okay once again on low settings. Not amazing graphics, but it's definitely passable in my opinion. And yeah, we can have an alright experience here with the 1660. And we're back here, by the way, because I want to try a little bit of FSR once again. If you don't mind utilizing that, you might be able to get 60 plus pretty much at all times here. And I think that's going to be the case, guys. Look at that, 60s in this intensive area for a GPU to handle because of a lot of vegetation, you know. That's always intensive in UE5 titles. This is so awesome. Especially, once again, given that these GPUs, the first two, are below system requirements. Maybe because of the VRAM, because in terms of performance, they clearly can run the game, right? But yeah, guys, down here it just becomes less intensive, 70s, probably going up into the 80s inside of there, and it doesn't even drop from 60 FPS around here, so pretty decent results for a UE5 title. Once again, I'm very impressed here, guys. But let's go back to TAA and try the optimized settings. Maybe they're going to be adequate for a 1660. Okay, optimized settings with a GTX 1660. We're at 1080p native resolution. Lumen is enabled, TAA, and wow, that is a huge increase in performance compared to the GTX 1660. Whereas usually they're about 20% apart in performance. In this game, probably because of the Lumen stuff being more optimized for the Turing GPUs here, yeah, it makes a huge difference, guys. There's a 50% increase in performance compared to the GTX 1066 Gigabyte instead of the usual 20%. So that's pretty crazy. Obviously, these slowdowns still happened, of course. Those will happen all of the time here with these GPUs. Still curious to see if the 12 Gigabyte 3060 has them, though. This one was so close to be super well optimized, but then they had to ruin it with stuttering issues, right? Let's do FSR quality. I'm curious to see if we can hit a little bit smoother of an experience here. And indeed we can, obviously, like, that was obviously going to happen. But yeah, 40-ish FPS, 50-ish FPS sometimes, stuttering quite a bit here in this area though. But if you don't mind FSR on quality, I think 40 plus FPS, which is what we're getting here, is a lot better and a lot more enjoyable in a game like this. Even though it's single player and so on, it just makes a big difference to me at least. 40 FPS, way better than 30 FPS. And here we're getting like 45 on average, 38, 1% lows with those little spikes there previously. So not bad at all, 1660. Again, the developers did something right in this game. It's just a shame that it is so unstable. Next up, we have the first RTX GPU in this list, the RTX 2060. It's a 6GB model, and it's the Palit version of the card. It released in 2019, and it's also from the Turing architecture, just like the 1660. But of course, being an RTX series card, it has ray tracing cores and tensor cores for DLSS. Here we go, the RTX 2060 is now installed. You can see it right here again. And going over the settings, I'm starting at 1080p resolution using the same optimized settings by Digital Foundry, TAA, so it's native res here. And let's walk around for a little bit using these settings. As you can see, it's much faster once again than the GTX 1660. Yes, now I'm gonna start confusing RTX and GTX and oh, I thought it was going to be smooth now, but no, it still has those little slowdowns here and there. Well, here and there. It's only here. I mean, it's here and there. So it's accurate. Anyway, guys, we're getting 40-ish frames instead of those 30-ish that we saw previously. And now with the RTX 2060, since it's an RTX GPU, we have DLSS support. So I think with DLSS quality, we're going to be in for a really good visual fidelity experience, much better than with FSR on quality. But honestly, guys, I am happy with these results. Sometimes it goes up into the 50s. In the city area, it should probably be 50 to 60 most of the time, even 60 plus at times, which is great. And again, 40 plus FPS is what we've been seeing here. The 1% lows are a little bit lower, again, because of the slowdowns over here in this area. But yeah, it's 40 plus all of the time. I think that works pretty well in a Silent Hill game, you know. But let's try some DLSS on quality. And unfortunately, in this title, DLSS is not DLSS 4 because they didn't really bother implementing the latest version of DLSS for some reason. Still, compared to FSR, it looks way better. Yeah, 70 FPS sometimes. 63 on average in this section of the game is actually quite playable. But let's try a little bit of DLSS 4. Okay, for that, let's go to the Nvidia app over here, graphics, Silent Hill F, and, well, there we go. It's unable to retrieve settings. Even the Nvidia app can't understand the settings menu of this game. Anyway, we can still override the model here, so let's do that. Let's do the latest version of DLSS, and the game will now be running DLSS 4. Here we go. Yeah, that looks way better. I'm not gonna touch DLSS 3 anymore in this video, guys, but it is also a little bit more intensive, as I told you guys. So we're getting down into the 50s more often than the 60s, like previously. But yeah, it looks so much better that the trade-off is worth it, in my opinion. The game is still very playable, as I told you a million times before, with 40 plus frames per second, in my opinion, given the type of game that it is, you know. And now it looks quite a lot better in motion. It actually looks super similar to TAA native resolution, and sometimes you can still reach 60 frames per second, as you can see there, but it's not going to happen as often as previously. We lost about like 6 frames per second on average, or maybe 8, I don't know. I also think that you're going to spend more time in these city areas, you know, and in these areas it's going to be a lot better in terms of FPS anyway. So you're not going to come across a lot of vegetation, and you're going to see 60 plus FPS anyway with the DLSS 4 on quality. So it's definitely the way to go with the RTX 2060, guys, or other RTX GPUs. And I don't know why the developers didn't implement the DLSS 4 by default, but hey, it's an easy fix. You just do that on the Nvidia app and everything will be fine. Also, we just went through this little area again, and no big stutter like we saw with the 5090. So the 2060 still doesn't suffer from those issues. Hopefully it's been fixed, actually. I don't know. It had a day one patch as well, so maybe it could be running better at this point. But yeah, DLSS 4, definitely a go here, my friends. Next is a very popular GPU. It used to be the most popular on Steam, the RTX 3060. This is a 12GB version of the card. It's also the Afox model here. It released in 2021, and it's from the Ampere architecture. Here we go, 3060, 12GB is installed and running, and let's go over the settings here. I'm starting at 1080p resolution again, utilizing the Digital Foundry optimized settings, and I kept the texture quality to low, but I will increase it a little bit later. I just want to see if there's still texture pop-in with a 12GB GPU here. TAA, and let's do this. So this is native 1080p resolution, guys. We're getting 60-ish frames per second, down into the 50s sometimes. Let's go in this direction first, actually. Yeah, 54 there, 55. So very similar FPS to what we saw with the 2060, with DLSS quality enabled and DLSS 4 quality as well, right? Maybe a little bit better, actually, in this area. Ooh. Oh, that's a lot of ghosting from TAA. Holy crap. Damn, that's the first time that I noticed it, really. Like, over here, it isn't as obvious, but over there in that scenario, yeah, super obvious ghosting. Okay, anyway, let's see if we have those inconsistencies in the frame time right now. Going down the hill over here. All right. And yes, it still happens. It slows down slightly over here in this area, but it's not as much as with the other GPUs, right? We saw much bigger spikes there with all of the other cards that we've tested so far, and it turns out that 6GB of VRAM is enough for low textures and low settings, and even these settings that we're utilizing here, the optimized settings from Digital Foundry, they only allocate around 5GB of VRAM, and those are true VRAM numbers. That changes everything, guys. 6GB GPUs are going to be as playable as 12GB GPUs or 8GB GPUs in this game. So if you have a GTX 1660 or a 2060 6GB GPU, don't be afraid, because it will run pretty much as well as other cards with more VRAM if you keep the textures on low. It's actually decent optimization, guys, which is incredible. I can't believe I'm saying this on a UE5 title. Aside from the stutters and the slowdowns and so on, it is pretty decent in terms of optimization. But as you saw, I just selected the high textures. I'm restarting the game from scratch. And now we should be getting pretty much the same FPS, because texture quality doesn't usually impact performance too much. And indeed, that's exactly what we're seeing here. Maybe like 1 or 2 less FPS, but it's about the same thing. And the VRAM allocation is now over 6GB. So on high textures, even 8GB GPUs should still be fine. Very nice to know that as well. Okay. And yeah, the only major complaint here that I have is the stuttering, especially on the 5090 that I tested. That was unbearable and completely unplayable. But here, yeah, not too terrible, guys. 60 FPS average, look at that. And we're still at native resolution. We're not even utilizing DLSS. I'm going to enable it right now. This is already DLSS 4. I already overrode it. And here we go. This is sharper, actually. Like, at a first glance, going from TAA to quality DLSS, this is actually a little bit sharper, which is kind of incredible. Because it's 720p internally, once again. But hey, DLSS 4 is really awesome, even at 1080p resolution in this game, apparently. Yeah, 70s, 61% lows. Even with those slowdowns there, it's not really dropping our 1% lows by a lot. This is good. And again, this is all in an intensive area for the GPU to render with a lot of vegetation. This initial part of the game, this is actually pretty good. I'm liking this. I think this can do 1440p pretty well as well, so let's try it out. Alright guys, so we're back here at 2560 by 1440 resolution, utilizing the same settings. I'm gonna disable the DLSS for now. So we're back to temporal anti-aliasing at native 1440p. And damn, okay, that's not too bad. Alright, 40-ish. This is still at native 1440p, remember that. 40-ish, 30s, high 30s. This is doing the same as what? Like the GTX 1660 at 1080p? Maybe a little bit better than that, actually. Yeah, that one was dropping into the low 30s, right? So pretty impressive stuff, guys. Compared to other titles, again, that run the same engine, this is looking great, and it performs acceptably on the 3060 at 1440p. So I can't really complain much about that. But let's test it how I'd actually play this game at 1440p, and that's with DLSS quality, because DLSS 4 at 1440p looks amazing, guys. It looks... I'll say it. It looks better than with TAA in this game. And you get way higher FPS at the same time. 50s now. So it's going to be much more enjoyable in terms of mouse input lag and so on because, well, we're getting higher FPS. I'm not talking about frame generation and stuff like that because this game doesn't really have that. But yeah, it feels a lot better and more responsive with 40, 50 frames per second than it did with 30 and low 40s. In terms of visuals, it's native 1440p. I'm looking at a native 1440p image in my head, but I know it's upscaling from 960p, and this is absolutely insane because it looks better than native 1080p resolution, my friends. It's also a little bit more intensive like this on quality DLSS than it was at 1080p, but this is good. I could play the game all day long like this, basically. I wouldn't because it still stutters a lot, and I hate stuttering. But again, if you can put up with that, this is going to be a pretty enjoyable experience with a 3060, even at 1440p resolution, as long as you replace DLSS 3 with DLSS 4 and play with quality DLSS. Let's check it out with DLSS performance at 1440p, because usually I wouldn't do this. But sometimes, in few titles, it actually looks really good still, and that is the case. Okay, this game works really well with the upscalers, guys. Damn, at least with DLSS. Now I'm seeing a bit more shimmering and a bit more... I don't know, it looks like popping, but it can't be popping because we didn't really change any settings, but yeah, it's maybe shimmering. And it's also a little bit softer than it was with DLSS quality. The shadows on our dress, for example, look pretty pixelated and noisy. Not great. Quality is definitely the way to go, especially given that this doesn't even give you 60 plus 100% of the time, right? I'm just showing you options here, all right? And we get around, what, 10 more FPS, around that, on average, than we did previously with quality DLSS. Next, we have the RTX 4060, the current most popular GPU on Steam. This is an 8GB GPU, a little bit of a downgrade there compared to the 3060, very unfortunate indeed. It released in 2023 and it's from the Ada Lovelace architecture. And here we have the RTX 4060 is running the game right now. Let's go over the settings. Again, we're at 1080p resolution, same Digital Foundry optimized settings with high textures since it didn't go over 8 gigabytes previously. And the anti-aliasing is set to TAA. And look at that, guys, at native 1080p resolution, the 4060 is doing a pretty good job, getting 60 to 70 frames per second in this area, which is, again, very intensive for GPUs to render. Those little spikes there and the slowdowns aren't as noticeable. Anyway, around here, 70s up to 80 FPS at times. Very impressive, guys. 69 average with TAA, my friends. Okay, so this is still native resolution, not even utilizing DLSS on quality yet, and it doesn't seem to be dropping from 60 FPS, although it gets really close. Like we saw 60 flat right there, or 61 FPS for a second, but yeah, this is stable. It's really pretty as well. It has that ghosting effect, though, which is terrible, of course. I really hate that, but, well, you gotta put up with that crap with UE5 titles sometimes. If you want to play at native resolution, well, there's a way to play with DLAA, of course, but that will also tank your FPS down a little bit further. Oh, and I forgot to override DLSS this time, so let's just do that. Okay, DLSS is set to quality. As you can see, this is DLSS 4 now, and we're back here at the beginning, getting 90s, 80s. And again, I think it looks better this way. Yeah, quality is the way to go, in my opinion. It works really, really well here. Big spike there, as usual. Another one right here is about to happen. There we go. Yeah, those... I don't know why those are always there. Like, we've loaded that area. It needs to be something loading as we walk, right? Like, it needs to be like the city area loading in as we go down the hill. But at the same time, if we go up the hill and down the hill again, that keeps on happening. It's weird. I'm curious to see if it will have a big stutter where the 5090 got the big stutter as well. So I'm just going to play all the way through there. All right, here we go. In this area, look at that. 100 plus FPS. That's really nice. Okay, that's good. That's good, especially with these visuals, because it looks great with these optimized settings as well. Very close to the maximum settings in the game. Yet it does run a lot better in maximum settings, of course, and we're almost there. This is it. No big stutter. If the 5060 has a big stutter there, I'm gonna be so mad, dude. Because that narrows it down to 50 series being just unstable, I guess. Or maybe it's the 5090 that's unstable and the other 50 series aren't. Okay, that was a big one, but this is shader compilation stutter, because the CPU utilization went up to 100%. And these will be bigger. The spikes will last longer if you have a weaker CPU, by the way. So keep that in mind. This is why, like, this big stutter right here, this is why I'm testing only the first part of the game. But I keep telling you that the game does stutter quite a lot whenever you are out of there. But let's try a little bit of 1440p resolution with the optimized settings again. Let's go back to native with TAA here, and let's start a new game. Here we go. We're getting 40-ish FPS at 1440p TAA, guys. And the optimized settings still running Lumen and everything, which looks awesome. Yeah, I mean, the fact that we're running Lumen on high and we're getting playable frame rates on a 4060 at 1440p in 2025 in a game released this year is amazing. Right? It's also having a couple of more stutters right now, actually. Maybe it's running out of VRAM at this point, because the RAM utilization also went up slightly when those stutters happened. So that indicates a VRAM bottleneck scenario. So at 1440p, you will need to drop down the textures to like medium. And this is something that we did not need to do with the RTX 3060, which is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, we're back at it again, guys. After a restart of the game, we're at medium textures still with all of the other optimized settings enabled, of course, lumens and so on. And now the VRAM allocation is a little bit lower. It's between 6 and 7 gigabytes most of the time. Maybe it's going to go up a little bit, but we're not seeing those bigger spikes right now in the frame time graph as we saw previously. So it's going to be a little bit more stable. RAM utilization or allocation there, it's actually the allocation, is not hitting 13 gigabytes like it did previously. It's very close. but it's not hitting that, so it's a little bit lower than what it was before, indicating that we did indeed swap some things that should have been on VRAM into the RAM previously, and that caused a little bit of instability. Still very playable, obviously, even with high textures, but I prefer a little bit more stability when I can have control over it, basically. I can't have control over the shader compilation stutters and traversal stutters, but over these, I can. Okay, so let's use DLSS on quality, DLSS 4, once again. Start counting our FPS. We're starting with 69 there. At least we got 69 for a second there. And now things are definitely better than with the RTX 3060, aside from the texture being on medium instead of high now. But hey, what can you do? 8 gigabytes. Anyway, yeah, 61 FPS average, 48% lows. It's stable, it's pretty, it looks like native 1440p at this point, and inside of the city it will always be above 60 FPS. So, can't really complain about that, guys. Yeah, it does dip down into the 50s, but I think this is the way to go and the way to play this game with the RTX 4060, if you have a 1440p monitor, of course. I wouldn't recommend a 1440p monitor these days with a 4060, if you're wondering, but it does work here in this particular title. And lastly, we have the latest 60-tier GPU here. This is the RTX 5060, still with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, unfortunately. Like, 3060 has 12. What are you doing, Nvidia? This one released this year, 2025, and it's from the Blackwell architecture. Here we go, the RTX 5060 is now installed, and let's go and play the game now. Let's go over the settings first, of course. We're utilizing 1080p resolution, the textures are back to high, same settings everywhere else, of course, and we're at TAA as well, so native resolution. We're getting 90 FPS, or close to it, so another decent bump in performance over the RTX 4060 here. Not too bad. It's a shame that this is still an 8 gigabyte GPU though. Like, what are they doing? It's 2025. It's no time to be releasing 8 gigabyte cards, in my opinion, because as we'll see, at 1440p, it should be a pretty stable experience in terms of frame rate still. I think it will have the horsepower to run it well, but with the medium textures, because we can't use high textures because of 8 gigabyte of VRAM. Like, what the heck? Anyway, over here, yeah, those little spikes are even less noticeable now that the frame rates are higher, of course. Okay, let's keep on going here. I'm gonna go to the city area. I'm really curious to see if it will have a big frame time spike. I'm thinking it won't, actually. I'm thinking it's just something to do with the 5090, and I don't know. We're already seeing a little spike here, by the way. First time that we've been to this area, so it needs to load it. Okay, we're almost there, guys. We're almost there. 1% lows aren't as good as previously, are they? I think so. But let's see. Moment of truth. Will it have a big frame time spike? No, not really. So it only happened with my 5090 for whatever crazy reason. I don't know. Maybe, again, the game got updated. It could also have been some other setting. I maxed out everything on the 5090 after all. But yeah, these GPUs seem to be pretty stable here, unless you need to compile shaders and CPU usage goes over the roof. But yeah, as you can see here in the city area, 100-ish FPS, not too bad. Frame time, yeah, we're starting to see those spikes because it needs to load things. But yeah, it works pretty well, as you can see in this one. This doesn't really consume all that much VRAM and so on. But let's go back to this area and check it out with a little bit of DLSS on quality, which, again, it's kind of crazy to say, but it actually looks better than TAA. Look at this. 100 FPS is not a major improvement in frame rates, actually. I thought it was going to be a bigger difference, right? We went from 90 FPS in this scenario to 104, so it's a really minor difference in terms of smoothness, but in terms of visuals, I think it looks better once again. And it's always above 60 FPS, so whatever you choose, it's going to be a great experience at 1080p resolution. But what about 1440p? I'm really curious to see that one. So I think I'm just gonna stop it right there for 1080p. You already know the DLSS looks great. It will perform with about 15 more FPS than previously at native resolution, so a really smooth experience indeed. Of course. I always need to get out of the game to play at 1440p, it's weird. Like, full screen is supposed to allow you to change resolutions, developers. Here we go, 2560 by 1440 resolution using the same optimized settings. I already lowered the texture quality to medium, by the way, and we're back to TAA, so native res, getting around 60 FPS. All right, so it still doesn't have the horsepower needed to render 1440p natively at 60 plus all of the time using optimized settings. The 5060 Ti would be the one capable of doing that. Anyway, yeah, around here, down into the 50s sometimes. This means that inside of the city, it would be 60 plus still at native resolution, but yeah, over here in intensive scenarios, basically, it drops down by quite a lot into the 50s, which is still very playable, as I said already, but there is a better way to play this game, right? And that is with some DLSS on quality at 1440p with this GPU. Since it was getting already like 50 to 60 FPS most of the time in this scenario, that means that with DLSS quality now, it gets us way higher frames than that. So we're up into the 70s. It shouldn't drop from 60 anywhere. And under any circumstance, basically, unless it's a big stutter, of course, then it drops to 0 sometimes, I guess. But yeah, this works really well right now, and it looks better than the TAA at native resolution. So use DLSS. Let's see if it gets the big one over in this area. Oh boy. Drum roll, guys. It does not. All right, it still had a little spike there, and it's still having those, which is weird. But yeah, that big issue that I had with the 5090 apparently is not a 50 series related thing. It's just a 5090 related thing, maybe. But yeah, guys, it stays above 60 FPS 100% of the time like this with DLSS quality. It looks better than native resolution. VRAM is under control all of the time as well. And you can have a pretty good experience with the 5060 in this title, although I do not recommend this GPU once again because of its lack of VRAM. But that's been it for this one. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. It's probably going to be the last one in Silent Hill F that I make because F UE5. I don't know, I just have more fun testing games that aren't in this engine, mostly because of the instability with the stuttering, honestly. But yeah, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next one. Love you all. Bye-bye.